Hey guys, welcome back to our channel, The Purpose Driven Homestead. It's a beautiful fall day today, and we wanted to actually share some updates with you on our quail. Now, since we talked to you last time, it's actually been quite some time. We thought we'd have a video for you guys pretty soon afterwards, just because we were kind of rolling with it and we were going really fast with our quail. We got our quail back in March. So if you haven't checked that video out, we did it back in March. I think we may have posted it in April, but I'll do a link here and you can check it out above. But that's where we actually were doing the pre-hatch. We were showing you our setup, and I will tell you that setup worked fantastic. So there was absolutely nothing wrong with the setup that we have. The issue that we had was all around the quality of the eggs. And I'm here to tell you that the good news is it absolutely wasn't normal. And so we've done several hatchings since then, and they've been much, much better. So again, if you didn't see that video, go back, check it out. That's where we show you this, the whole hatching setup that we had, and it actually really did work really well. Now, we've made some modifications since then with some of our more recent ones, and I'll share those with you in just a few minutes as well. So let's talk a little bit about what is the equipment that we use. Again, if you go back and watch that video, you'll see that we used a Nurture Right 360 hatching system. Now, we really like this. It's got room for about 22 regular chicken eggs or about 44 quail eggs. Now, we did notice, and we've done a couple of hatchings here now using that same system, we did notice that I think trying to put 44 eggs in the setup that we have is probably a little too much, and I'll tell you why. The way that it's set up, it's got concentric rings inside of the hatcher, and so when you look at those concentric rings, when you look down on them, the ones that are in the middle turn the least, right? And so when you just have one egg in there, that's not a big deal. But we've actually done it 3 times now, and we've noticed every single time we've done a hatching on those, none of the eggs on that center ring have hatched. Now, we had doubled them up for quail eggs, so what we're going to do is next time we're going to just put single eggs in that center. Now, for the others, we had double eggs and all of those, and they were large enough and they turned enough because they were far enough away from that spoke system that they seemed to do fine. But for us, it just seems like having 2 eggs in those center, even though it'll hold them because the quail eggs are like half the size of a chicken egg, it just didn't seem to do very well. And I think they weren't getting enough movement during the turning section of the incubation period. So when they were turning, a lot of them maybe, I noticed towards the end, they were getting caught up and they were just kind of dragging around in the same position, and that's no good for your eggs, right? You need to be turning those. And I think that made a big difference. That inside edge just didn't get enough. And so we're going to just put single eggs in those going forward, because I think that's going to make a big difference. They'll get more action, they'll get more movement when it's doing its turning, and I think that will make a difference in the hatch rate. So that first batch came from the hatchery. I mentioned that we only had about a 40% hatch rate, but the second batch were actually ones that were laid by our quail. So our quail were laying, we had the roosters in with the hens, and we had a very good hatch rate out of those. It was about 75% hatch rate, and that's way different than our first batch, right? So I'm gonna cut away now, and I'm gonna show you just a little bit of the actual hatching process so you can see some of these guys. They are just super cute when they're little, but they grow phenomenally fast, right? So I'm going to cut away now. I'm going to actually show you some of these quail as they were growing. It's really phenomenal. They're super cute. If you've got kids at home, this is the kind of thing that you live for on a farm, is when you have these little hatchings and they come out and they've got these little bitty tiny animals. It's just so amazing. So I'll go ahead and do that right now. So I'm going to also share with you during this time some pros I think that come along with raising quail, and I think they are numerous. And then also some things that we've learned along the way that you just would need to account for if you decide to raise them as well. I do think that the pros far exceed the cons when it comes to quail, but I'll share those with you in just a second.
It's not the destination, it's all in the journey. You gotta be patient, don't be in a hurry. It's not the destination, it's all in the journey. You gotta be patient, patient. spend too long just trying to be perfect. You can't please everybody, not worth it. Sometimes you just gotta do you. Stop comparing yourself, cause you feel like a fool. If there's no pain, there's no growth. And I could just turn and go. But here's what I know. It's not the destination. It's all in the journey. You gotta be patient. Don't be in a hurry. It's not the destination. It's all in the journey. You gotta be patient. Patience. It's not the destination. It's all in the journey. You gotta be patient. Don't be in a hurry.
So one of the first things I think you can pick on really quickly is that these things are quiet. When you're talking about a backyard homestead, like a lot of us are trying to do, you can find very few animals besides maybe rabbits that are as quiet as these quail. In addition to being quiet, they also grow super fast. So these things go, so put in perspective, right? When we get chickens, layers typically will take from about 6 to 7 months to go from chick when you buy them all the way to the point that they're laying and they're mature enough to do that. For quail, that same time frame is only about 8 weeks. So it only takes you about 8 to 10 weeks for those animals to begin laying eggs and be in a spot where they can actually start producing new quail. That's a phenomenal turnaround. So now I get it. They are indeed smaller birds, right? So if you're looking for a chicken, they're smaller than chickens. They run only a fraction of the size of a chicken, but they actually grow very, very fast. You can produce a large number in a small space and still get that same level of production, but in a shorter time frame. Now, I don't want to undersell how fast these things grow. So we've got some Cornish cross that we're raising right now as meat birds, and they grow really, really fast as well, right? So from the time that we got those to butchering is going to be about 8 or 9 weeks. So if you put that in perspective, those grow really, really fast, right? But that is just so different than any other chicken out there. And the Cornish cross have a lot of challenges that come along with them, right? That they tend to overgrow their size very quickly, right? So sometimes that causes health problems, depending on how you raise them, how you're growing them out. So, I would say that outside of the Cornish cross, these things grow really, really fast, and they're a great source of on-farm protein. So the second selling point, right? The first one was that they grow phenomenally fast. The second selling point that I want to point out to you here is that they are sustainable. Now, when I use the term sustainable, lots of people use that term for a lot of different things. I want to be clear on what that means when I say it. So when I use the term sustainable, I mean the fact that you can actually raise generation after generation on a small backyard homestead with quail. Now, that's not nearly as doable when it comes to chickens. And the reason is because most places, if you live near neighbors or you live in a subdivision, you simply can't have roosters in a lot of cases. And as you well know, if you can't have roosters, then you can't have a flock that is sustainable. You have to continuously buy your chicks from somewhere else. That's not the case with quail. With quail, they are so quiet and the roosters are so quiet, even though they do crow like a rooster would, like a chicken rooster would. The crow is very, very quiet, and it sounds wild, right? It sounds like a wild bird that you would pick up, and it blends right in with any of the wild birds in your area. Most people can't tell the difference between a quail crowing and a chickadee. Obviously, I know a lot of people probably here in this community can, but for a lot of people that are just, lay persons, they just don't know the difference, and it blends right in. It's not obnoxious, and that makes it a lot simpler to keep your neighbors happy and to raise the food that you want to raise all at the same time. Now you have to decide, is this something that you want to make a centerpiece protein choice? Now when I use the term centerpiece protein choice, lots of people diversify, right? So you may have beef, you may have rabbit, you may have chicken, you may have quail, you may have a lot of different options. You may hunt and have venison or a number of other things, but what is it that you're going to choose as kind of your centerpiece? Are you going to diversify? Are you going to be one or two things? Are you going to still buy some? Those are all things that you have to consider in what we call Homestead math, right? And so when we do our Homestead math, we start thinking about how much would it take to feed 6 people on a regular basis. Now, in our case, our goal is we say, hey, if we have 6 people, we want to eat twice a week. That's about 48 quail that we would need to raise each month in order to eat quail twice a week as a protein source. So that's a lot of quail for us to raise. Now, we think 48 is very doable, but for others that may be too much, or maybe it's not enough, right? So you've just really got to make the decision early on. How much do you want to fill that particular need with quail versus chicken or other protein sources? In our case, we'll be diversifying. We'll have rabbit, we'll have quail, we'll have chicken, we'll have some beef. Right now we can't raise our own, but we will still buy that from local providers as well. So we're going to diversify that. You can go through 1 culling or 2 cullings a month, and you can get that, throw them in your freezer, and you've got protein source for twice a week. Now, if you then go fishing or you go hunting, you can see that you can close the gap on a lot of these things very quickly, right? But you've got to do that Homestead math and figure out how many of these you potentially would need each week, each month, etc., in order to feed your family. So let's talk a little bit about cons now, right? Things that you'd want to consider if you decide that you want to raise quail. I don't think any of these are deal breakers by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think some of them are ones that you'd want to consider. The first of which is, compared to chickens, because they are smaller, we tend to put more in a brooder at any given time, and that makes them a little stinky while they're in the brooder. So I don't know that I'd say that they are dramatically smellier or less smelly than, say, a chicken would be, but because they're smaller, we can put more of them in the brooder and keep them at any given time, and that does tend to make the brooders get stinky faster. So we're constantly having to change out or add bedding to the brooders while they're growing. And so that's something you're going to have to consider, especially if you have a setup where maybe you put your brooder inside. I wouldn't do that. We did it for just a short period of time, but we try to keep ours in our garage where it's a little bit less noticeable until they're ready to go out on pasture. And that's actually what we do, is we keep ours on pasture. And that helps dramatically with any animal, I think, when you have them pasturing and moving them constantly. I think that makes the smell just almost non-existent at all. The other thing that I'd say is quail eat a lot. Now, do they eat any more than chickens? Maybe. I don't know that I'd say, I don't know that we've done a great comparison to be able to say pound for pound, do they eat more than chickens, but I will say that they eat quite a bit. So you need to keep that in mind. I'd say maybe it's just a little north of what a chicken would eat of the same size, but hard to tell. The other thing is they need game bird feed. They need a higher protein because they grow at a faster rate, much like meat chickens do. Because they're growing at such a fast rate, they need a specialized food. So you can't just go in and get the layer crumble or the layer pellets. You need something that's for a game bird, and that tends to run a couple dollars higher at most feed stores, or even if you're getting at a mom and pop place, it tends to run a little bit higher, and that's because it's got a higher protein content than the standard layer feeds or even just regular old flock feeds would. So just keep that in mind. Those tend to run a little bit higher, but the payoff is these things mature much faster and you can harvest faster. So I'll show you the brooder box setup now, and that's kind of the final thing. When you're ready to take these guys and put them out of the incubator and into the brooder, you don't need any specialized equipment, right? You can just use a regular old tote. We like clear totes because we can see through and the birds can see through. It tends to get them less startled when you walk up on them. And when we went from our first batch to our second and third and so on, we actually replaced a piece of our infrastructure. We used to have a heat lamp that we used for our chickens, and we used it for our first batch of quail as well. But what we found is because the quail were so small, we didn't like having to put that heat lamp so deep into the brooder, because we were concerned that if there was ever an issue and the heat lamp fell over or there was a problem and it shorted, it was so close to the bedding that we didn't want to have a situation where we would start a fire. So we replaced that heat lamp with a chick heater. And what that does, it allows the chicks to get underneath there. It's adjustable in height. So when we have chickens, we raise it up for the chickens. But when we have a quail, we lower it down because they're much smaller birds. But it allows them, just like a mother hen would have her chicks kind of gather underneath her, and she'd put her wings around them and they kind of get underneath her for warmth and crowd underneath her. It serves the exact same function. So this thing is a heater that has radiant heat that kind of goes down towards the bedding and allows the chicks to go in there, and they're able to huddle underneath it. And then when they get a little too warm, they can move out, they can move away, they can kind of get anywhere they want and stay warm. But I love the fact that there's no glass and there's nothing hanging down to then bust or get knocked over, cause a problem for our children if they happen to hit it, knock it over and get cut by glass or something like that. We just didn't like that setup any longer now that these things are available, and they're much safer too, right? This way we can have it set up in there. It doesn't get super hot, but it does allow the chicks to get everything that they need. So we really, really like that change that we made made with the ladder sessions, and we'll use that for our chickens as well. Fact is, when we did our meat chickens, they used a larger version of this in there as well. Worked fantastically. They were able to duck underneath there, stay warm, and everybody seemed really, really happy. So we like that setup better than the heat lamp. So that's one change that we made for sure. I will also mention that from what we found, those heaters that I just talked about tend to be quite a bit more efficient than, say, a heat lamp. A heat lamp is going to heat all the air around it, and it's very inefficient for when it comes to just cost savings, right? That thing runs 400 watts or so. A lot of times you'll get several hundred watts worth of that heating lamp, 200, 300, 400 watts. For these heaters, it's only about 125 watts, so it uses it much more efficiently, and we've seen that the price of doing that just seems to be a lot less, especially if you're going to do them frequently, than using a large bulky heat lamp that heats everything around it and just use resistance coils inside the heat lamp to make that heat. So that's also one thing that I'd suggest you consider as well when you make that choice. Now, once these guys have feathers, and they really grow fast, right? So you can see here, you know, from our video today, that these guys put on feathers really quick. They grow really fast, and so once they get a little larger and they're able to regulate their own temperature, and you don't see them under that heat lamp or that heater very often, then they're ready to go on pasture. And that's what we've done with all of ours. We've raised all of ours on pasture, so we haven't lost a single bird while they've been on pasture, and that's pretty phenomenal. We lost a couple right after hatching, which is pretty normal. Just some of them aren't going to make it. But once we got them out on pasture and out of the brooder, we've not lost a single chick. And I truly believe that that's because they're getting a lot of extra minerals and vitamins and just healthy stuff from the grass that they're eating. We've actually noticed that they'll go and they'll peck and they'll eat. And so as we're able to move those birds, you know, each and every day into new space, it protects them, and it also allows them to get all of those great nutrients. They're able to get gravel and little sand, you know, stuff that they need just to grind up their food. You know, they're able to roost down and kind of get into that grass and make little nests for themselves, the hens are. So it's really nice to see that, and it's still fresh pasture every single day. So we really highly recommend that. So we're going to show you that in our next video. We're going to show you how we have that set up for the pastured raised version of our quail, and some things that we did well and some things that we changed with our second generation tractor that I'd encourage you not to do as well. So that's all coming out in our next video, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that's today's video, guys. Thanks for sticking around. God bless you, and we'll see you next time on the Purpose Driven Homestead.